She stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, red wine dripping from her pale pink dress, while the flashes of paparazzi cameras blinded her. The crowd didn't gasp in sympathy. They snickered, but the worst part wasn't the laughter. It was her husband standing next to the woman who threw the drink, holding her hand instead of his wife's. They thought she was a nobody, a distinct liability to his rising career. They had no idea that the helicopter landing on the roof at that very moment carried a man who could buy and sell everyone in the room before breakfast. They humiliated the wrong woman, and her father. He's about to burn their world to the ground. The air inside the Pierre Hotel's grand ballroom smelled of expensive perfume, old money, and desperation. It was the night of the Sapphire Gala, New York City's most prestigious charity event for the arts. If you weren't on the list, you didn't exist in Manhattan society. Charlotte Banks adjusted the strap of her modest beige gown. It was a simple dress off the rack, something she had bought 3 years ago for a cousin's wedding. Beside her, Richard Banks, her husband of 5 years, checked his reflection in a passing waiter's silver tray. Richard was handsome in a way that felt manufactured: perfect teeth, perfect hair, and a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating blue eyes. "Stop fidgeting, Charlotte," Richard hissed, not looking at her. "You look nervous." "It makes me look weak." "I'm sorry, Richard," Charlotte whispered, clutching her purse tighter. "It's just, everyone is staring. And you know I don't like leaving the kids with a new sitter." "The kids are fine, and people are staring because you're wearing that." He gestured vaguely at her dress with a sneer. "I told you to buy something new, something designer. We have the money now." "We have debt, Richard," she corrected gently. The new firm, the lease on the penthouse, the Porsche were leveraged to the hilt. Richard spun on her, gripping her elbow tight enough to bruise. "We are investing in our image. I am the youngest partner at Sterling and Finch. I need a wife who looks the part, not a librarian." Charlotte bit her lip. She didn't tell him that Sterling and Finch, the massive private equity firm he had just joined, had a silent owner he had never met. She didn't tell him a lot of things. When they met 5 years ago, she was just Charlie, a volunteer at a soup kitchen. She had wanted to be loved for who she was, not for the burden of her last name. She thought Richard loved her. But lately, Richard only loved Richard. "Go get me a drink," Richard commanded, loosening his grip, "and try to stay in the shadows. The CEO, Mr. Henderson, is here. I need to make an impression." Charlotte nodded and walked toward the bar, her heart heavy. As she waited for a scotch on the rocks, she heard a commotion near the entrance. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Walking in was a vision in scarlet silk. She was stunning. Tall, with raven black hair cascading down her back, and a dress cut so low it was technically illegal in 3 states. Diamonds dripped from her ears, diamonds that looked suspiciously newer and larger than anything Charlotte owned. It was Tiffany LaCroix, the Instagram model turned brand ambassador. And, if the rumors in Charlotte's gut were true, Richard's current obsession. Charlotte watched, frozen, as Tiffany didn't walk to the bar or a table. She walked straight toward Richard. Richard didn't look annoyed. He didn't look surprised. He lit up. He straightened his tie and stepped forward to meet her, a genuine smile breaking across his face, the kind of smile Charlotte hadn't seen in 2 years. "Make that a double," Charlotte told the bartender, her voice trembling. Charlotte navigated back through the crowd, the glass of scotch trembling in her hand. She intended to hand Richard his drink and perhaps suggest they leave early, but as she approached, she realized she couldn't get close. Richard and Tiffany were holding court in the center of the room. A small circle of junior executives and social climbers had gathered around them, laughing at something Tiffany was saying. "Oh, Ricky, you're terrible." Tiffany laughed, placing a manicured hand flat on Richard's chest. Ricky. He hated being called Ricky. Yet he was beaming. Charlotte took a deep breath. She had to be the wife. She had to be strong. She stepped into the circle. "Here is your drink, Richard," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The laughter died down instantly. Tiffany turned slowly, her eyes raking over Charlotte's beige dress with a look of pure, unadulterated pity. "Oh, wow," Tiffany said, her voice shrill and loud enough to carry over the string quartet. "Is this the housekeeper? Ricky, you brought the help." A few people chuckled nervously. Richard's face flushed, not with defense for his wife, but with embarrassment. "Tiffany, this is Charlotte, my wife." "Oh," Tiffany feigned shock, covering her mouth. "The wife, the one you told me about, the one who told me about, the one who, how did you put it, drags you down." The room went silent. The string quartet seemed to stop playing. Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Richard, silently begging him to shut this down, to defend her. Richard looked at the floor, then at Tiffany, then finally at Charlotte. His eyes were hard. "Charlotte, you're embarrassing me. Why are you hovering?" "I brought you your drink," she said, her voice cracking. Tiffany stepped forward, invading Charlotte's personal space. The scent of overpowering Chanel No. 5 choked the air. "Honey," Tiffany purred, "look at you. You're a mouse in a room full of lions. Ricky is a star. He's going to run this city one day. And you? You look like you should be running a bake sale." "Excuse me," Charlotte said, dignity straightening her spine. "I think you should leave." Tiffany laughed, a harsh, metallic sound. "Me? Leave? I'm the guest of honor, darling. Richard invited me, actually." Tiffany turned to the crowd, raising her voice. "I think it's time for a toast." She grabbed a glass of heavy Cabernet Sauvignon from a passing waiter. "To Richard Banks," she shouted, "the future CEO, and to shedding dead weight." On the words dead weight, Tiffany's wrist slipped. It wasn't an accident. It was a calculated, physics-defying launch. The entire glass of dark red wine splashed directly onto Charlotte's chest. The cold liquid soaked through the beige fabric instantly, turning it a deep, bloody crimson. It splattered onto her face, dripping from her chin. The crowd gasped. Then, silence. Charlotte stood there, blinded, wiping wine from her eyes. She waited for Richard's jacket. She waited for his handkerchief. She waited for his handkerchief. She waited for him to yell at Tiffany. "Look what you did!" Richard yelled. Charlotte opened her eyes, relief flooding her until she realized Richard wasn't looking at Tiffany. He was looking at her. "You clumsy idiot," Richard hissed at Charlotte. "You bumped into her. You ruined Tiffany's moment." Charlotte's jaw dropped. I didn't move. You are a mess," Richard spat, his voice echoing in the silent ballroom. "Look at you. You're stained. You're pathetic. Get out before you ruin my career any further." Tiffany smirked, handing her empty glass to a waiter. "You heard him, sweetie. Run along. The adults are talking." Tears, hot and stinging, welled in Charlotte's eyes. She looked around the room. Hundreds of New York's elite were watching. Some were recording on their phones. No one moved to help. They were predators watching a wounding. "Richard," Charlotte whispered. "If I walk out those doors, I'm not coming back." Richard laughed. He actually laughed. "Is that a threat? Charlotte, look at me. Look at Tiffany. Then look at Tiffany. Then look at yourself. You're lucky I let you stay this long. Go back to the suburbs where you belong." Charlotte nodded slowly. A strange calm washed over her. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve, the same resolve her father used when he executed a hostile takeover. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll go." She turned on her heel, wine dripping onto the marble floor, and began the long walk to the double doors. Behind her, she heard Tiffany say, "Finally." "God, Ricky, I don't know how you survived 5 years with that." "It's over now, babe," Richard replied. As Charlotte pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom, she didn't head for the exit. She headed for the VIP elevators. She reached into her wine-soaked purse and pulled out a phone. Not her cracked iPhone with the family photos. A sleek, black satellite phone she kept for emergencies. She dialed a single number. Sterling Residence. A crisp British voice answered. "Alfred," Charlotte said, her voice devoid of emotion. Patch me through to my father. Immediately. Miss Charlotte, is everything all right? Your father is currently in a board meeting in Tokyo via satellite, but Alfred, code red. There was a pause. Connecting you now, ma'am. 5 seconds later, a deep, gravelly voice thundered on the line. Charlie, what's wrong? Are the kids safe? The kids are fine, Daddy, Charlotte said, stepping into the elevator and pressing the button for the roof. But I need a favor. Name it. I'm at the Pierre, the Sapphire Gala. I know it. I own the building, her father, Arthur Sterling, said. I thought you were playing middle class with that husband of yours. Not anymore, Charlotte said, watching the floor numbers climb. He just humiliated me. Publicly. He's with a mistress. They threw wine on me, Dad. He kicked me out. The silence on the other end of the line was terrifying. It was the silence of a man who could dismantle economies. He did what? Arthur's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. I need you here, Dad. I'm done hiding. I'm in the chopper. We were landing at JFK, but I'm diverting to the pier. I'll be on the roof in 4 minutes. Bring the lawyers, Charlotte said, wiping a smear of wine from her cheek. Charlie, Arthur growled, I'm bringing the whole damn board. The wind on the rooftop of the Pierre Hotel was vicious, whipping Charlotte's wine-soaked dress against her legs. She shivered, not just from the cold, but from the adrenaline dumping into her system. Below her, the city twinkled a million lights representing a million dreams. And down in that ballroom, her husband had just crushed hers. But the sound of the wind was soon drowned out by the rhythmic, thumping roar of rotors. Out of the dark sky, a black shape emerged. It was a Sikorsky 76, sleek and predatory, the same helicopter usually reserved for heads of state. On the tail, illuminated by the landing lights, was a silver crest, a lion holding a key. The logo of Sterling Global. The helicopter touched down with a heavy mechanical sigh. Before the rotors even stopped, the side door slid open. 2 men in dark suits jumped out first, Arthur Sterling's personal security detail. They scanned the roof, spotting Charlotte immediately. They didn't look at her like she was a stained housewife. They looked at her like she was the crown jewels. Then Arthur emerged. At 62, Arthur Sterling was a terrifying figure. He stood 6'3", built like a linebacker who had transitioned into corporate warfare. He wore a charcoal Tom Ford suit that cost more than Richard's Porsche. His silver hair was swept back, and his face was a map of hard-won victories. He didn't run to her. Arthur Sterling never ran. He strode across the tarmac with a purpose that made the very ground seem to tremble. He stopped 2 feet in front of her. His steel-gray eyes, usually so guarded, scanned her from head to toe. He saw the shivering. He saw the red stain covering her torso. He saw the mascara running down her cheeks. His jaw tightened so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. His jaw tightened so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. Daddy, Charlotte choked out, the strong facade cracking for just a second. Arthur took off his suit jacket, a heavy, cashmere blend coat, and draped it over her shoulders. It was warm and smelled of sandalwood and pipe tobacco, the scent of her childhood. The scent of safety. Who threw it? Arthur asked. His voice wasn't loud. It was low, a rumble of thunder before a tornado. Tiffany LaCour, Charlotte said, pulling the coat tighter. Richard's mistress. Richard laughed, Dad. He told me to leave. He called me a liability. Arthur buttoned the jacket around her chin. Richard Banks. That's the name of the man who did this. Yes. Arthur turned to his head of security, a massive man named Graves. Graves. Sir. Call the acquisition team. I want a full audit of the Pierre Hotel's guest list. I want to know every asset Richard Banks owns. I want his credit cards frozen. I want his access codes revoked. And call Henderson. The CEO of the firm, sir. Yes. Tell him to meet me in the ballroom in 5 minutes. Tell him if he's late, he's fired. Arthur turned back to Charlotte. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, gently wiping a spot of wine from her forehead. "You have two choices, Charlie," he said softly. "We can get back in that chopper, fly to the Hamptons, and I will destroy him from a distance. You never have to see him again." Charlotte looked down at her stained dress, then up at her father. She thought about the 5 years she spent supporting Richard. The night she stayed up helping him format spreadsheets. The cheap noodles she ate so he could buy better suits. The love she had poured into a black hole. "What's the second choice?" she asked. Arthur smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was a shark's smile. "We go downstairs, we walk right through the front door, and we remind them who actually owns the ground they stand on." Charlotte took a deep breath. The cold air filled her lungs. She stopped feeling like Richard's victim. She started feeling like Arthur Sterling's daughter. "I don't have a dress, Dad." Arthur looked at her, covered in the oversized men's jacket, her hair windswept, her eyes fierce. "You don't need a dress, sweetheart," he said, offering her his arm. "You're wearing the blood of your enemies. It's the best outfit in the room. Let's go hunting." Back inside the grand ballroom, the party had reached a fever pitch. With the depressing wife gone, Richard Banks felt invincible. The tension in the room had dissolved, replaced by the clinking of champagne glasses and manic laughter. Richard stood near the orchestra pit, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a fresh glass of whiskey. Tiffany was draped over his shoulder, literally and figuratively. She was currently recounting the story of the wine spill to a group of sycophants, and then she just stood there. Tiffany shrieked with laughter, throwing her head back. "Like a wet dog! I almost felt bad. Almost." The group roared with laughter. "You were too kind, honestly," Richard said, smirking. "I should have divorced her months ago. She just doesn't fit in this world. She's simple." "Well, you're free now, Ricky," a junior partner named Steve said, raising his glass. "To the new regional director. I heard Henderson is going to announce the promotion tonight." "Fingers crossed," Richard said with mock humility. "I've worked hard for this." Suddenly the lights in the ballroom flickered. It happened twice. Then the heavy double doors at the main entrance, the ones Charlotte had left through, slammed open with a violence that shook the walls. The music died instantly. The chatter ceased. 12 men in black suits marched in. They didn't look like hotel security. They wore earpieces and moved in a V formation, clearing a wide path through the center of the room like a snowplow clearing a road. "What is this?" Tiffany whispered, clutching Richard's arm. "Is it a raid?" "Relax," Richard said, though his heart hammered. "It's probably a VIP, maybe the governor." But it wasn't the governor. At the back of the V formation walked Arthur Sterling. A collective gasp went through the room. Everyone knew Arthur Sterling. He was a myth, a titan. The man who owned the holding company that owned the bank that owned the firm Richard worked for. He was 3 levels above God in their industry. And walking right next to him, wearing his massive charcoal suit jacket over a wine-stained pink dress, was a woman. Richard squinted. The woman looked familiar. But she walked with her head high, her face set in stone. She looked regal. Dangerous. "Is that?" Steve dropped his glass. It shattered on the floor, but no one looked. "Is that your wife?" Richard felt the blood drain from his extremities. Charlotte. It was impossible. Charlotte was a mouse. This woman walking in was a queen. Arthur Sterling stopped in the exact center of the room. The silence was absolute. You could hear the ice melting in the buckets. Richard, relying on his blind arrogance, decided this was his moment. He assumed Charlotte had gone crying to some distant relative, and that relative had somehow crashed the party. He didn't connect the dots. He only saw Arthur Sterling an opportunity. He shook off Tiffany and stepped forward, smoothing his tie. "Mr. Sterling," Richard called out, his voice cracking slightly before he found his executive tone. He walked toward the center of the room, forcing a smile. "What an honor. I'm Richard Banks from Sterling and Finch. We met briefly at the shareholder meeting last year." Arthur Sterling didn't look at Richard. He looked at a spot on the wall behind Richard's head. Richard stopped 3 feet away, confused by the lack of acknowledgement. He glanced at Charlotte, his eyes narrowing. "And Charlotte," Richard hissed, dropping his voice so only they could hear. "What the hell are you doing? Who did you pay to get back in here? Take that jacket off, you look ridiculous." Arthur slowly lowered his gaze to Richard. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Mr. Banks," Arthur said. His voice was deep, resonating off the high ceilings. "You seem to be having a good night." "The best, sir," Richard beamed, oblivious to the axe hanging over his neck. "We're celebrating a record quarter. Actually, I was hoping to introduce you to my fiancée, Tiffany." He gestured for Tiffany to come over. Tiffany sashayed over, flipping her hair. "Hi, I'm Tiffany. I'm a huge fan of your money." She giggled, thinking it was charming. Arthur didn't blink. He turned to Charlotte. "Charlotte," Arthur said, his voice carrying to the back of the room. "Is this the man?" Charlotte looked Richard dead in the eye. For the first time in 5 years, she didn't look at him with adoration. She looked at him with boredom. "Yes," Charlotte said clearly. "That's him. And that's the woman who threw the wine." Richard laughed nervously. "Mr. Sterling, please ignore her. We're going through a messy separation. She's a bit unstable. She's just a housewife who doesn't understand our world. I'm actually having her removed by security right now." Richard turned to one of the men in black suits. "Excuse me, can you escort this woman out? She's trembling. She's clearly having a breakdown." The security guard didn't move. Arthur Sterling let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "You want security to remove her?" Arthur asked. "Yes, please," Richard said. "It's embarrassing for the firm." Arthur took a step closer to Richard. He towered over him. "You idiot," Arthur whispered. But the room was so quiet everyone heard it. "Excuse me?" Richard blinked. "You said she doesn't understand our world," Arthur said, his voice rising to a boom. "You said she is just a housewife. You said she is just a housewife. You said she is a nobody." Arthur placed a heavy hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "Mr. Banks, I don't think you've been properly introduced." Arthur swept his hand toward the crowd, addressing the hundreds of stunned onlookers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur bellowed, "I would like to introduce you to the only person in this world I answer to. My only child. The sole heir to the Sterling Empire. And, as of this morning, the owner of the controlling interest in Sterling and Finch." Arthur looked down at Richard, whose face had turned the color of old ash. "Meet Charlotte Sterling, your boss." The silence broke. A murmur of shock waved through the room like a tsunami. Richard's knees actually buckled. He grabbed a chair to steady himself. "Sterling, no, her name is Banks. She's nobody. She volunteers at a soup kitchen." "I volunteer," Charlotte spoke up, her voice clear and strong, "because I believe in giving back. Something you know nothing about, Richard." Tiffany, realizing the ship was sinking, tried to pull her hand away from Richard's arm, but she was frozen in shock. You lied to me," Richard stammered, looking at Charlotte with wild eyes. "You never told me you were rich." "I didn't lie," Charlotte said coldly. "I told you my father was in management. I told you we were comfortable. You never asked for details, Richard. You were too busy talking about yourself. And I wanted to know if you loved me or my checkbook." She stepped closer, the wine stain on her chest now looking like a badge of war. "I got my answer tonight," she whispered. "Wait," Richard said, panic setting in. "Charlie, baby, wait. This is a misunderstanding. The wine. It was an accident. Tiffany slipped. Tell him, Tiffany." Tiffany's eyes went wide. "Me?" You told me to do it. You said she needed to be taught a lesson." "I did not," Richard screamed. "Enough," Arthur barked. Richard screamed. "Enough," Arthur barked. Richard screamed. "Enough." Arthur smacked his fingers. From the side of the room, a short, balding man in a tuxedo came running. It was Mr. Henderson, the CEO of Richard's firm. He looked terrified. "Mr. Sterling," Henderson gasped, bowing slightly. "I had no idea. I swear." "Henderson," Arthur said, pointing a finger at Richard, "is this man employed by my company?" "Currently, yes, sir." "And does my company have a policy regarding the public harassment and humiliation of its board members?" Henderson gulped. "Zero tolerance, sir." Henderson gulped. "Zero tolerance, sir." Arthur turned back to Richard. "Richard Banks, you are fired. Effective immediately. You are also barred from entering any Sterling Global property. That includes this hotel. That includes your office. And—" Arthur paused, a cruel glint in his eye. "Charlotte, didn't we co-sign the lease on his penthouse last year as a gift?" Charlotte smiled. "Actually, Daddy, you bought the building last month. The lease is at will." Arthur nodded. "Right. Richard, you're evicted. You have 1 hour to vacate the premises before my team throws your suits off the balcony." Richard stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock, his career, his home, his reputation incinerated in 3 minutes. But Charlotte wasn't done. She turned her gaze to Tiffany. Tiffany shrank back. "Look, honey, I didn't know. I'm just a girl trying to—" "Save it," Charlotte said. She reached into the pocket of her father's coat and pulled out the soaking wet napkin she had used to wipe her face. "You like wine so much?" Charlotte asked. She tossed the wet, red-stained napkin. It slapped against Tiffany's expensive white silk dress, leaving a hideous red smear right over the heart. "You can have him," Charlotte said to Tiffany. "I think you two deserve each other. He has no job and no money. Let's see how long true love lasts." Charlotte turned to her father. "I'm ready to go now, Dad." "Not just yet," Arthur said, his eyes fixed on the crowd. "There's one more thing." The silence in the ballroom was heavy, the kind of silence that usually follows a gunshot. Arthur Sterling held the room in the palm of his hand. Richard Banks, pale and sweating, looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and hadn't hit the bottom yet. "One more thing?" Richard rasped, his voice trembling. "You fired me. You've evicted me. What else could you possibly take?" Arthur signaled to Graves, the head of security. Graves stepped forward, holding a silver tray. "It wasn't for drinks, Mr. Banks," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a conversational, almost pleasant tone that was infinitely more terrifying than his shouting. "Sterling Global has a strict policy regarding company assets. Since your employment is terminated for cause, specifically gross misconduct and public reputational damage, all company perks are to be surrendered immediately." I can return them on Monday," Richard stammered, trying to regain a shred of dignity as the crowd watched, phones held high, recording every second. "Now," Arthur said. Arthur pointed to Richard's wrist. The Patek Philippe watch. It was a signing bonus technically on loan from the firm's collection until your 5-year vestment period. You made it to year 5, minus 3 days. Richard clutched his wrist. "You can't be serious. Everyone is watching." "Give it to him," Charlotte said. She didn't shout. She just stared at him with eyes that were no longer full of tears, but full of ice. With shaking fingers, Richard unclasped the $50,000 watch and dropped it onto the silver tray with a heavy clank. "The phone," Graves said, extending his hand. "Company property contains sensitive client data." Richard handed over his sleek smartphone. He was now cut off from his contacts, his bank apps, and his lawyers. "And the keys," Arthur added, "to the Porsche 911 GT3. The lease is in the company's name." Richard looked at the valet ticket in his pocket. He looked at Tiffany, who was staring at him with a mixture of horror and calculation. If he lost the car, how would they get home? "Arthur, please," Richard begged, his voice cracking. "It's raining." "At least let me keep the car for the night. You can take an Uber," Arthur said, cold, "if you can afford it without the company credit card." Richard threw the keys onto the tray. "Now," Arthur turned to the crowd, his demeanor shifting instantly from executioner to gracious host. "I apologize for the disruption, everyone. Please, enjoy the rest of the evening. The open bar is now on the house courtesy of the new owner of Sterling and Finch." He gestured to Charlotte. The crowd erupted into applause. It was sickeningly fickle. 10 minutes ago they were laughing at her. Now they were cheering for the Queen. Charlotte saw it for what it was. She didn't smile. She turned to leave, her father's arm around her. But Richard, driven by a surge of desperate panic, lunged forward. He grabbed Charlotte's wrist, not covered by the jacket. "Charlie, wait!" he screamed. "You can't do this! What about the kids? You're going to destroy their father! We have a family!" The security guards moved to tackle him, but Charlotte held up a hand. She stopped them. She turned slowly to face Richard. She looked down at his hand gripping her wrist, then up at his face. "The kids?" she asked softly. "You mean the kids you didn't want to waste money on for a babysitter tonight? The kids you haven't seen in 3 days because you were working late with Tiffany?" She leaned in close, so only he could hear the venom in her voice. "You aren't worried about the kids, Richard. You're worried about child support. But don't worry. I won't ask you for a dime. Because where you're going, you won't be able to earn one." She ripped her arm from his grasp. "Goodbye, Richard." Charlotte and Arthur walked out of the ballroom, the heavy doors swinging shut behind them, sealing Richard's fate. Richard stood alone in the center of the circle. He turned to Tiffany, a desperate smile plastering his face. "Babe," he said, breathless, "it's okay. It's just a setback. I'm talented. I'll get a job at Goldman or J.P. Morgan tomorrow. They'll beg to have me. We can go to your place tonight." Tiffany looked at him. She looked at the empty wrist where the Patek used to be. She looked at his empty hands. She looked at the red wine stain on her own dress that Charlotte had put there. "My place?" Tiffany scoffed. "My place is a studio apartment in Queens, Ricky. I thought we were going to the penthouse." "We will. I need to sue them. I'll get a settlement." Tiffany pulled out her phone. "Uber is $40 to Queens. Do you have $40? Richard patted his pockets. His wallet was there, but his cards were all corporate Amex cards. He had maybe $20 in cash. I can transfer you." "You don't have a phone," Tiffany reminded him coldly. She shook her head, a look of pure disgust crossing her face. "You know, she was right. You really are a loser without the suit." "Tiffany," she turned on her heel and walked toward a group of investment bankers near the bar, smoothing her hair and lowering her dress's neckline. She didn't look back. Richard Banks was left standing in the middle of the Sapphire Gala, penniless, phoneless, and wifeless, while the orchestra began to play a cheerful waltz. 1 week later, the Motel 6 off the New Jersey Turnpike smelled of stale cigarettes and regret. It was a far cry from the penthouse overlooking Central Park. Richard sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at a small, boxy television. On the screen, the business news channel was running a segment. The headline read, "Sterling Haislers takes the helm. Starlot, Sterling a Pope-inted chairwoman." The footage showed Charlotte walking out of the Sterling Global headquarters. She looked transformed. She wore a tailored white power suit, her hair cut into a sharp cheek bob. She looked powerful, beautiful, unattainable. Richard threw the remote at the wall. It shattered. There was a knock at the door. Richard scrambled up. Tiffany, he hoped. She hadn't answered his calls, made from a prepaid burner phone in 6 days. He opened the door. It wasn't Tiffany. It was a process server, a burly man with a chewing tobacco stain on his lip. Richard Banks. "Yes," Richard sighed. "You've been served." The man shoved a thick envelope into Richard's chest and walked away. Richard tore open the envelope. It was divorce papers, but it wasn't just a petition for divorce. It was a restraining order, full custody filings, and a financial disclosure. Richard scanned the documents, his eyes widening. He grabbed his burner phone and dialed the number of the only lawyer who would take his case on contingency, a strip mall attorney named Saul. "Saul, I got the papers," Richard yelled into the phone. "Calm down, Richie," Saul wheezed. "Did you read them?" "Yeah, but look, we can fight this. I want half, Saul. I want half of everything. We were married for 5 years. That's marital property. I don't care if she's a sterling. In New York, I'm entitled to maintain the lifestyle I was accustomed to." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Richie," Saul said slowly, "do you remember the prenup you signed?" Richard rolled his eyes. "Yes, I remember. It was a joke. She downloaded it off the internet. It was some generic LegalZoom form. She didn't have any money back then. I only signed it to shut her up because she was worried about my student loans affecting her credit." "Right," Saul said. "I pulled the copy from the county clerk." "Richie, did you actually read the generic form?" "I skimmed it," Richard admitted. "It was standard stuff. What's mine is mine, what's yours is yours." "Not exactly," Saul said. "I had a forensic contract specialist look at it. It looks like a standard form, but Clause 14, Section B, is unusual." "What does it say?" Richard felt a cold pit form in his stomach. "It says," Saul read, the sound of paper rustling in the background, "any and all assets, future inheritances, trust funds, or business interests held by either party's biological family are permanently excluded from marital property, regardless of commingling." And here's the kicker, Richie. There's a bad faith clause. "A what?" "A bad faith clause. It says that if one party is proven to have committed adultery which leads to the dissolution of the marriage, that party forfeits all rights to spousal support, alimony, and, oh boy." "And what?" Richard screamed. "What is it?" "It triggers a penalty," Saul said, sounding impressed. "If you cheated, you technically owe her for the living expenses she provided during the marriage. Richard, her lawyers have itemized every rent payment, every grocery bill, and the lease on the Porsche for the last 5 years. They are suing you for restitution." Richard dropped onto the bed. "She planned this," he whispered. She knew. She knew the whole time." "It gets worse," Saul said. "Sterling Global filed a criminal complaint this morning." "Criminal?" "Embezzlement." "Criminal?" "Embezzlement. Apparently, you used the corporate card to buy a Cartier bracelet last month, and a trip to Cabo. But you listed them as client entertainment expenses. I was going to pay it back. Well, they have the receipts, and since the client was listed as a Miss Tiffany LaCroix, who is not a client, that's fraud, Richie. Grand larceny. They aren't just suing you, they're looking to lock you up." Richard hung up the phone. The room felt like it was spinning. He had thought Charlotte was a naive, simple woman who was lucky to have him. He realized now, too late, that she was a sleeping dragon. She hadn't hidden her wealth to test him. She had hidden it to protect herself from men exactly like him. And when he failed the test, she didn't just leave, she executed a demolition. His burner phone buzzed. A text message from Tiffany. Image attached. It was a screenshot of an Instagram post. It was a photo of Tiffany holding a massive bouquet of roses. The caption read, "So grateful for fresh starts, number single life, number beginnings," and below that, a text from her. "Don't contact me again. The FBI called me asking about the bracelet. I told them everything. I'm not going to jail for you. Lose my number." Richard stared at the phone until the screen went black. Outside, the sound of a siren wailed in the distance, getting louder. Richard walked to the window and peered through the blinds. A police cruiser was pulling into the motel parking lot. He wasn't a rising star. He wasn't a billionaire. He was a cautionary tale. 6 months later, the Southern District of New York Federal Courthouse was a place where dreams went to die, usually buried under mountains of paperwork and fluorescent lighting. For Richard Banks, it was the final circle of hell. The courtroom was packed. The Sapphire Gala scandal had dominated the tabloids for weeks, fueling a voracious public appetite for the downfall of the arrogance he represented. Richard sat at the defense table, his hands trembling. He looked nothing like the man who had sneered at his wife 6 months ago. His hair, once perfectly coiffed, was thinning and unwashed. His suit, provided by a public defender after Saul dropped him for non-payment, was 2 sizes too big, making him look like a child playing dress-up. "State your name for the record," the prosecutor, a shark of a woman named Miss Holloway, demanded. Richard Banks," he stammered. "And you are aware of the charges against you? 1 count of grand larceny, 2 counts of wire fraud, and 1 count of embezzlement regarding the unauthorized use of sterling global corporate funds." "Aye, it was a misunderstanding," Richard whispered, leaning into the microphone. "I intended to pay it back. I was a partner. Partners have expense accounts." Ms. Holloway smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. She turned to the witness box. "The prosecution calls Miss Tiffany LaCroix to the stand." Richard's head snapped up. "Tiffany?" She walked in, looking notably less glamorous than before. She wore a modest grey cardigan and very little makeup. She avoided Richard's gaze entirely. "Miss LaCroix," Miss Holloway began, "did Mr. Banks tell you that the Cartier bracelet and the trip to Cabo were business expenses?" Tiffany sniffed, dabbing her nose with a tissue. "No, he told me he owned the company. He told me his wife was a non-factor and that he had unlimited access to the accounts. He used me. He told me to throw that wine. He said it would be funny." "La!" Richard screamed, jumping up. "You begged for that trip. You said you'd leave me if I didn't buy you jewelry. Order!" Judge Harrison banged his gavel, the sound cracking like a whip. "Mr. Banks, sit down, or I will have you bound." Richard slumped back, defeated. He watched Tiffany testify for 20 minutes, dismantling his character piece by piece to save her own skin. She painted him as a manipulative monster, and herself as a naive victim. In exchange for her testimony, she had received full immunity. When the verdict came, it was swift. "Guilty on all counts," the foreman said. Judge Harrison lowered his glasses. "Mr. Banks, you lived a life of privilege that most can only dream of. You had a loyal wife, a high-paying job, and healthy children. You threw it all away for vanity. I sentence you to 36 months in a federal correctional facility, followed by 5 years of probation. You are also ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $450,000. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. 3 years? But "I have a family." "You had a family, Mr. Banks," the judge corrected cold. "Bailiff, take him away." As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, cold, hard steel biting into his skin, Richard turned to look at the gallery. He saw Charlotte. She was sitting in the back row next to her father. She wore a simple black coat, her face unreadable. Richard opened his mouth to shout, to beg, to say something, but he found he had no voice. Charlotte simply watched him, her eyes clear and dry. She didn't look angry. She looked bored. She stood up before he was even out the door, turning her back on him to speak to her father. That was the worst punishment of all. He wasn't even worth watching leave. 8 months later, the Federal Correctional Institution in Otisville was not the Club Fed Richard had hoped for, because of the high-profile nature of his fraud and the amount of money involved. He wasn't in the minimum security camp. He was in general population. "Banks, you missed a spot." Richard flinched. He was on his knees, scrubbing the cafeteria floor with a grey, foul-smelling rag. He looked up to see a massive inmate named Tiny standing over him, holding a tray of slop. "Sorry," Richard mumbled, scrubbing harder. His hands were raw and blistered. The soft, manicured hands of a finance executive were gone, replaced by the rough, cracked skin of a janitor. "My cousin lost his pension because of guys like you," Tiny spat, kicking over his milk carton onto the floor Richard had just cleaned. "Clean it up." Richard grit his teeth, tears stinging his eyes. He wiped up the milk. Later that night, in his cramped cell, Richard lay on the thin mattress that smelled of mildew. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from under his pillow. It was a printout his lawyer had sent him. A news article. The headline read, "The new Queen of New York, Charlotte Sturd Sternlinger Lynch's global initiation." There was a picture of her. She looked stunning, wearing a dress that likely cost more than Richard used to make in a month. She was smiling, cutting a ribbon on a new building. Richard stared at the photo. He remembered the night of the Sapphire Gala. He remembered calling her a librarian. He remembered telling her she was an embarrassment. "You idiot," he whispered to himself in the dark. "You absolute idiot." He rolled over, facing the concrete wall, and for the first time in years Richard Banks cried, not for his lost money, but for the realization that he had held a diamond in his hand and traded it for a piece of broken glass. 1 year later, the Gold Gala. The Pierre Hotel had seen many parties, but tonight was different. The Sapphire Gala was a memory. Tonight was the Gold Gala. The theme was rebirth. The ballroom was transformed with white roses and gold silk. The guest list was tighter, more exclusive. If you were here, it wasn't just because you had money. It was because Charlotte Sterling wanted you here. Tiffany LaCroix was not here. Rumor had it Tiffany was currently working as a hostess at a mid-tier steakhouse in New Jersey, having been blacklisted from every major social circle in Manhattan after her testimony revealed her own greed. She had tried to launch a beauty line, but the internet trolls, fueled by the viral video of Charlotte humiliating her, had destroyed the brand in 24 hours. Inside the ballroom, Charlotte moved through the crowd with grace. She wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. She was the sun. She stopped to speak with the board of directors of Sterling Global. "The numbers for Q3 are excellent, Charlotte," Mr. Henderson said, looking at her with genuine respect, bordering on fear. "The acquisition of the tech firm was genius." "Thank you, Henderson," Charlotte said, taking a sip of sparkling water. "Just make sure we keep the employee retention program. I don't want us becoming the kind of company that treats people like liabilities." Henderson nodded vigorously. "Of course, ma'am." Charlotte, she turned to see her father, Arthur Sterling. He looked older, a little softer around the eyes, but still a lion. "It's time for the speech," Arthur said. Charlotte took a deep breath. "I'm nervous." Arthur laughed. "You nervous?" Arthur laughed. "You nervous? You dismantle the man's life with a wet napkin and a satellite phone call. You'll be fine." Charlotte smiled and walked up the stairs to the stage. The room went silent instantly. No one shushed the crowd. They just stopped talking out of respect. "Thank you all for coming," Charlotte began, her voice steady and warm. 2 years ago, I stood in this room wearing a dress covered in red wine. I felt small. I felt like I didn't belong." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "I was told I was a nobody. I was told I should go back to the suburbs. And for a moment, I believed it. But then I remembered who I was. I remembered that dignity isn't something a man gives you. It's something you keep for yourself." There was a murmur of agreement in the room. "Tonight," she continued, "all proceeds from this gala go to the Second Chance Fund. It's for women who are starting over. For women who need to leave toxic situations but don't have the means. Because no woman should ever have to stay with a man. Because no woman should ever have to stay with a man because she can't afford a lawyer." The applause was deafening. It wasn't the polite golf clap of the rich. It was genuine, raucous cheering. As Charlotte stepped off the stage, she felt a vibration in her clutch. She pulled out her phone. It was a blocked number. She usually didn't answer, but something told her to check the voicemail. She stepped out onto the balcony, the cool night air of New York brushing against her face. She pressed play. "Charlie?" It's Richard." The voice was raspy, broken. It sounded like it was coming from a tin can. I only have 2 minutes on this calling card. Look, I saw you on the news in the rec room. You look beautiful. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I know it doesn't matter now, but I'm sorry. I wish I could go back. I wish I had just taken the drink you brought me. I wish... Bist, the automated voice cut in. You have 10 seconds remaining. I hope you're happy, Charlie. Really, you deserve it. Click. Charlotte lowered the phone. She looked at the screen for a long moment. In the past, she might have felt a pang of guilt. She might have wondered if she was too harsh, but then she remembered the way he looked at Tiffany. She remembered the dead-weight comment. She remembered him abandoning their children to party. She didn't feel sadness. She felt closure. Goodbye, Richard, she whispered. She tapped the screen and pressed delete. Then she opened her settings and blocked the number. The balcony door opened. It was Arthur. Everything okay, sweetheart? Charlotte turned to him, her smile bright and genuine. Everything is perfect, Dad. Good, because there's someone I want you to meet. The governor is here, and he seems very interested in your ideas for urban development. Charlotte took her father's arm. She looked back at the city's skyline one last time. A city that was once a prison of expectations, now her kingdom. Let's go, Charlotte said. I'm just getting started. She walked back into the warmth of the ballroom, leaving the cold night and Richard Banks in the darkness behind her. And that, my friends, is how Charlotte Sterling went from the wife in the corner to the CEO in the spotlight. It is the ultimate reminder that you should never, ever mistake someone's kindness for weakness, especially if their last name is on the building. Richard learned the hard way that when you chase glitter, you lose the gold. He's sitting in a cell thinking about it, while Charlotte is running the world. I'd say that's a fair trade, wouldn't you? Now, I have a question for you guys, and I want you to be honest in the comments. When Richard called her from prison at the end, did you feel sorry for him, just a little bit? Or did you think, nope, delete that voicemail, go? Let me know down below. If you loved this story, please do me a huge favor and smash that like button. It helps the algorithm find more people who need a little justice in their day. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Next week, I have a story about a lottery winner whose family tried to steal his ticket. You won't believe how he tricked them back. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, stay kind, and don't let anyone treat you like an option. See you in the next video.